We've had a slight change in the panel this morning. Unfortunately, David Martin, the Chief Executive of Dundee City Council, is unable to join us, but I'm delighted that Michael Woods, who's the Director of Children's Services and has been in his post about 5 years, Michael, and has been leading this work from Dundee City Council, is joining us on the panel. On my extreme left is Elma Murray, and I'm sure Elma is well known to most of you. Elma's the Chief Executive of North Ayrshire Council, has been since 2009, and she's been personally leading this work and the work in children's services in North Ayrshire Council. So we're delighted that Elma is here with us today. Louise, clearly I introduced a few moments ago, but I'm delighted that next to Louise we have Peter Mcleod. Peter was the Director of Social Work in Renfrewshire Council, I think, for about 7 years before being promoted to Director of Children's Services. So you have the whole range of services now within your area of responsibility. And I did mention earlier on that Renfrewshire Council and Renfrewshire Community Planning Partnership actually started this work. And I think I'm right in saying you're probably just close to repeating your survey. So you're well ahead of the rest of us. And you might want to ask questions of Peter as far as that's concerned. And beside me, I'm delighted to have my colleague from Angus Council, Tim Armstrong, is the Head of Children and Young People Services in Angus Council. And you've been in a senior position in Angus Council for many years. And again, Tim has been leading on the research work that we're all involved in for the last couple of years in Angus Council. So I'm delighted to be joined by all of the colleagues. I have a couple of questions that I'm going to start, and perhaps if I may, Michael, with yourself, clearly you heard from the Deputy First Minister about some of the expectations government have of us. What do you think are the main challenges facing children's services, and what impact do you think they will have on our work? Really easy one to start with, isn't it?
Thank you. I hope this is working. I think in terms of the challenges that we're facing, I would be fairly confident that around the room here today, you'll be very, very mindful of these challenges and the challenges that each of us face in our day and daily working. For me, much of what's been said this morning from both the Deputy First Minister and from Louise encapsulates the work that's going on here, that for once we've been able to move from an anecdotal-based, we think this is what the problems are, we guess what the problems are, to a much more empirically based model for making decisions. And that is part of the opportunity that we can put on the table to deal with some of the challenges coming up right now. Biggest challenge in terms of children's services is how do we galvanise the time, the effort, the energy in the system to make sure that what we're doing is the right thing at the right time for the right young people. And how do we do that at a point in time when we know that across the country that there are demands, there are pressures on finance, there are pressures on times, and how do we make sure that we actually make a difference? And the third area, which I think is a significant challenge, already been touched on this morning, is how do we actually galvanise the collective power in the system so that every key player out there is making a contribution to making change happen for young people. That they're not operating in silos, they're not doing what they've always done in the hope that sooner or later things will turn around and they'll be right, that they're actually doing what needs to be done based on the evidence and the information that we've actually got. And when you look at the real challenges, that are live challenges we experience on a day and daily basis, we're talking about challenges around parental impact, the way in which parenting operates, the challenges for poor parenting on young people. We're talking about the way in which we have an endemic issue about substance misuse across our areas. We're talking about mental health issues, and the list goes on. So there are actually no shortage of challenges out there. But if we get it right collectively, and by collectively I mean sitting around a table as an equal partner in a meeting, not as a bit player, and making sure that everybody knows exactly what his or her or their role is in making change happen, then we'll see a real impact, and that impact will be all to the good for our children and young people across Scotland, not just Dundee.
Thank you very much, Michael. Perhaps if I can move on to ask Elma a question. Elma, one of the surprising issues, I think, one of the surprising findings from the survey work when we had our session was of the child population, the high percentage who were in high need but not in receipt of services. What do you think that means for us in terms of the design of services going forward?
Okay, thanks, Bernadette. And first of all, I'd just like to say I'm really impressed with how many people are here who aren't from the five authorities and CPPs that have been working on all of this. It's great to have so many of you here to take part in the conversation and understanding some of the work that we've been doing. The first thing is, Bernadette, you're absolutely right. Yes, when we looked at those circles, the three circles that Louise presented so well earlier on, yes, it was a big surprise for us. And part of the reason it was a big surprise for us was because we had already committed to moving resources and funds to early intervention even before we started doing this work. So we knew we were doing some things that we thought were right, but what the evidence was showing us is that we still weren't getting to the right children all of the time. And what we then started to think about was, well, how do we create that shift? And for us, it's been a number of things that we've started to work on, and it'll not be a silver bullet to make that shift happen for sure, but it will be a result of, first of all, much greater integration, alignment of resource. And it's not about necessarily moving money from one service provider to another, but actually about how you use the totality of resource that service provider has to provide the very, very best possible service that they can for specific children in specific areas. So that integration and alignment has to change. The second thing for me has been about looking at what the other four areas have been doing, the other four sites have been doing, and understanding what's working within their context and how applicable that is to our context. So that's really, I would call that benchmarking. And for those of you that know me, you will know that I'm a big supporter of benchmarking and learning from what others have done and taking that and applying it in our own area. So that's also a really important part of how we redesign and reflect what we're learning. And then there's another range of things that are going to sound very kind of removed from children, but they're in the booklet that Louise and Dartington have produced for you today. And it talks about using the data to reflect on practice, on process, and on policy. And it's that combination of using data to influence all of those three areas of work simultaneously. And I don't think any of you would expect me to finalise what I'm saying without then talking a wee bit about influence and the role of elected members. What we found, and particularly the diagram with the three circles in it, that was actually the diagram that we found in North Ayrshire was the one that our elected members latched onto immediately and right across the board. When they saw our data and they saw particularly that diagram, quite frankly, they were astonished, but also not quite horrified, but really concerned that we weren't getting it right often enough. And that gave them, I think, a real impetus to get us to continue with the work that we were doing. But the point I'm actually trying to make is that visual representation of the data is so important to influence people who like to see things in pictures, who are much more visual than perhaps some of us that love data. And I'm one of those that loves data. And it was just, for me, it was almost like a real kind of catalyst to try and move our members into thinking about how we design and operate our services differently. And that has had a huge bearing on our community planning partnership and how we work right across all of the community planning partners to bring forward a better set of proposals for children's services.
Thank you very much, Elma. And our experience is quite consistent with yourself. Louise, obviously you were talking about your work in Scotland, and you've worked now in Scotland and south of the border. Do you want to say something more about your reflections on the experience that you've had working with the 5 sites here in Scotland?
Sure, yeah. I mean, I think we're very fortunate to be able to work in Scotland, and we can compare our experiences to working in England. Now, there are many benefits. First of all, to be able to create those circles that you referred to required us to be able to take the data that was provided by children and match that with data that's held administratively. And it was by putting those 2 bits of data together that we were able to create those 3 circles. We have struggled to do that in England. So in England, we can't with so much confidence say this is the relationship between needs and services. So there is something about the way that you're managing your information that allows you to get greater insights. The absolute kind of holy grail in all of this would be also to add in the health perspective as well, which I hope we're going to be able to do as we develop the work with Renfrewshire. So that would be the first thing. I think the second thing is the policy context in Scotland is much better aligned to this type of work, with your commitment to community planning partnerships, with the commitment to early intervention and the early years collaborative, and with people like John Swinney actually talking about research and evidence and the importance of data. So I think you have a fortunate opportunity in Scotland in that you're big enough to make a really big impact, but you're small enough to do that across 32 authorities. In England, it's very diffuse. Our system is much more fragmented. I don't think we've got the opportunities to do the sorts of things that you could actually do in Scotland. And I would say the same if I was in England.
Thank you very much, Louise. Peter, perhaps if I can ask you a question. I know that in Renfrewshire Council, you've been concerned for some time about the number of looked after children. In recent years, that's come down. And maybe you could say something about how the Improving Children's Outcomes project has contributed to that.
Thanks very much, Bernadette. I think, first of all, to say that I, like Elma, am delighted to see so many people, not just from the 5 sites, because I do think that there is a real challenge to be met here for our nation, which is to make this type of programme available throughout Scotland. And I think the question that was asked and responded to affirmatively by the Deputy First Minister gives me great hope that we will see this as a transformative programme right across Scotland. And equally, just to say, I've been involved in various roles in the public sector for 30 years. This is the most powerful transformation project that I have been involved in. It's not just a project, because it's now part of the culture that we work within in children's services in Renfrewshire. And let me give you some metrics in answer to your question, Bernadette. I was very concerned, not just for Renfrewshire, but for Scotland, that we seem to see an increasing number of children being formally looked after. And as I sit here today, I can tell you that really only 4 years into the implementation, this can happen very quickly. 6 years from the beginning of the programme in data collection terms, and 10 years since I first met Louise and Michael in London and thought this needed to happen. As I sit here today, we have 50 less children looked after in accommodation. Our colleagues on the table across the room here in functional family therapy, there are around 25 young people not formally looked after because of the incredible work that you do. And we think that's a net saving to the system of something like £2.7 million. Now, through political leadership, which was reflected on several points and from several speakers, including Elma, that has meant that our political leadership has invested something like £7.5 million in an early years strategy, with Families First recently evaluated by Glasgow University as having international significance. So in 4 years, that's the shift that has happened. If because I'm a social worker now managing children's services and education services, and can I say it's slightly scary sometimes, but the teacher stuff is fine, Michael. I'm getting grip of that. But what's fantastic is whereas people like me who've spent their careers in services for vulnerable children, the teaching staff and the early years staff in Renfrewshire culturally now talk about paths and incredible years as the thing that makes a difference to the young people. And of course, Family Nurse Partnership, just in the front of the room here, 125 babies are having their lives transformed because of that programme. So 4 years later, Bernadette, that's the change. The metrics, the data, I think speaks for itself. The ability to reinvest that money saved to do different early intervention things is transformative. Please join the journey we're on.
Thank you very much, Peter. Question to Tim, if I may. Tim, I think it's fair to say that all the partnerships have found the fund mapping quite a challenge. It's kind of hard sometimes to get a sense of the total investment across public sector agencies in children's services. How do you think that authorities have found this very difficult to get the data, but also, if we're serious about this, then we need to, as Louise was talking about in her presentation, be able to decommission services as well to free up funding. How do you think we're going to be able to do that in these financially challenging times?
That's quite a complex question.
It is, sorry, I apologise.
Your questions are getting longer as we go through the panellists. I suppose there's two issues there for me. One is that the first that you raised, that the local authorities found the fund mapping challenging. And I suppose it was really difficult and complex separating out what we were spending on children's services because of the complexity of the services, and the complexity of the services reflect how they have grown and developed over the years. And I think it's true to say if we were starting from scratch, then we wouldn't structure or fund our services as we are just now. But we are where we are just now. I suppose also it reflects the fact that services don't exist in isolation for children's services, and often services are meeting multiple needs and complex needs. And I suppose particularly I'm thinking about adult services for adults with substance misuse, and their effectiveness can have a big impact on the outcomes for the children and young people that live within such families. And therefore it's really difficult to separate the needs of children from the needs of their parents. And therefore I think a number of the authorities found it really difficult to separate out and be specific about exactly what we were spending on children's services. I suppose you just at the end raised the issue about decommissioning services. And again, I think that reflects how complex our services are. I think in Angus, one of the things, particular problems we found was that staff and service users were particularly committed to services, and they had a high degree of loyalty. And therefore, decommissioning services can be very emotive, and it needs to be handled very carefully. I suppose the approach that we've taken in Angus is rather than thinking about decommissioning services and stopping services and ceasing services, it's actually been about how can we get our services to do things differently? How can we get services that are currently working with families to actually stop, think about what they're doing, look at the evidence-based practice and actually adopt new ways of working to get better outcomes. And I think that's helped us avoid some of the challenges of stopping services and actually decommissioning services outright. We are in difficult financial times just now, and I think that's only going to get harder. And I think one of the things we're very conscious is that if we continue to do exactly what we're doing, actually we're onto a loser. Things are just going to get more and more challenging. And therefore, I think the research has allowed us to think about the key areas that we need to challenge in order to actually achieve that shift to a more early intervention preventative approach.
Thank you very much, Tim. Perhaps if I can just pick up the issue of funding in terms of the Perth and Kinross experience. One of the objectives of this programme is to shift spend. It is to shift spend towards more prevention and early intervention work. In Perth and Kinross, we opted for 3 evidence-based programmes. One was family nurse partnerships, One was Strengthening Families and one was Incredible Years. The Council, in terms of funding, 2 of those programmes invested an additional £1.25 million. We have invested other monies into early intervention work, but in terms of the evidence-based programmes arising from Evidence to Success, these are the 3 programmes. On top of that, NHS Tayside have invested about £900,000 in the Family Nurse Partnership Programme across Tayside. But it's not just about that additional investment. We've been training our children and family staff and our health visiting staff in the Incredible Years programme, so that's now part of the mainstream work, and we're doing something similar with the Strengthening Families. So it's about the workforce skills as well, and training and developing our workforce so that they're able to deliver those intervention programmes, which clearly are relevant in terms of the data that we have. Can I throw it open to yourselves in terms of questions now? Can I have an indication of questions, please, at this stage? There's a colleague down there. There's one down the front and one. So just because of the mics, I'll take you, and then the colleague down at the front, if that's okay. So the women there. Thank you very much. Could you say where you're from, please? That would be helpful.
Sure. Hi, I'm Morag Dorward. I'm AHP Lead for Children's Services in NHS Tayside. So I have involvement with 3 of the 5 sites, and we've had a lot of learning, which has been really positive. I think there's one issue that I know some of you will know that I'm likely to say, and that is about children with additional complex needs. And I think in Dundee, I chair a strategic planning group for children with additional complex needs, and we've looked at the data in some detail and have actually learned a lot from it in terms of its applicability to children with additional needs. But what we would like to point out as well is that actually the data isn't complete in terms of all children, because there are a number of children with complex needs who were unable to fill in the survey because of the nature of their difficulties. And certainly there have been some discussion in Tayside about how we collect information from them. And I think it's important that people, particularly who are not part of the 5 sites, are aware that there are gaps in this data in terms of some of the children, and that actually it's about looking at other data in addition before making final decisions about spend, but also recognising that although children with complex needs weren't necessarily included, they live in communities, they have social issues, the same as other children, and actually early intervention and prevention is really important for them. And I think that the key development outcomes that we found across are actually very applicable to children with complex needs as well. So there's lots that we can apply, but we need to be looking at other data and ways of collecting data in an equitable way for children with additional needs as well. So it was a comment and sharing learning, but also any responses would be very welcome, Bernadette. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I can't speak for the other sites, but I know that in Perth and Kinross, when we had the survey data, we matched that against what we knew already about children in the system. So we didn't just use the data, but I can't answer for other parts. But I will ask the question. Thank you very much, Margaret. Michael.
To answer part of the question, because clearly Morag leads one of my strategic priority groups, and I would say that in the area of additional support needs, she's like a terrier with a bone. So she certainly doesn't. She doesn't step back from asking the difficult questions, and that's absolutely correct. She should answer and ask those difficult questions. The reality is that there will be no survey in the known universe that will answer or ask every question that needs to be asked. That's life. You won't get that. What you need to do is to set the work of Dartington in a context. And that context is that what it does provide is a rich seam of empirical evidence that you can then use to inform your practice. But in addition to that, you have to step back from time to time and say, have we captured everything? Now, if the answer to that is no, you then have got to go out and say, right, how do we find that additional information? So within Dundee, the two areas that we've looked at in terms of the need to get more information would be in the area of additional and complex needs, for sure, but also in the area of looked after children. So we're talking to staff because professional knowledge and experience of people working on the ground, doing the job day in and day out, is really essential in driving forward or identifying what your priorities for improvement are. So it's absolutely right that Morag identifies that. It is not a catch-all survey. It captures a huge amount of rich data, but there will be areas that within your own local authority areas or within your own area of expertise, you step back and say, well, actually, we really need to find out a bit more about X or a bit more about Y, and that's perfectly acceptable.
Thank you, Michael. Peter.
Yeah, just a very brief response and a very affirmative one, Morag. We're about to embark on the second survey, the epidemiological survey, and we covered 13,500 children. We hope to do that again. And I think what I can very clearly tell you is that within that group, we will look at additional support needs, and therefore that will be done on the basis of probably, I think, Michael and Louise, the only place ever that's done this twice. So, you know, there's a real rich seam of data that will come out and see how the needs shifted. But that will be done within Renfrewshire. We just need to work it out now that you've asked the question. But we will do that, and you will have data to look at. And I think, as Elma said, that's then valuable not just within Renfrewshire's context, but across the sites and across Scotland.
Can I bring in the colleague there? I think it's Kevin, but I can't quite see. Is it Kevin? Can you say who you are?
Yeah. Yes, thanks very much. Kevin Mitchell, Executive Director of Scrutiny Insurance at the Care Inspectorate. I thought the presentation given by Louise was extremely powerful, and you could immediately see the huge benefit when planning, delivering and commissioning services with a particular focus on improving outcomes. Like Elma's elected members in North Ayrshire, I was immediately drawn in the support and documentation to the three circles, if you like, and the mismatch between children's needs and service provision. And that I suppose took me to the importance of the data, and I suspect that absolutely critical to that process is the consistency in the data gathering. And I suppose that then took me to the notion of trust and confidence and the potential to share information and experience and best practice between the 5 sites. Very interesting that 3 are in the east and 2 are in the west, which I think is extremely helpful to compare and contrast. And I just wondered what the panel's experience was that, you know, in terms of suspecting that you have that trust and confidence and the ability and willingness to share that information and data, whether that highlights good practice or challenges for improvement.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I think I'll ask Elma and perhaps Louise to answer that question. Elma, would you like to start? Louise.
Thanks, Bernadette, and thanks very much for your question, Kevin. That for me, and I talked a bit about benchmarking, which probably doesn't do it justice, but that for me was pretty critical to what we were doing, because the 5 sites are not the same. They're quite different in their demographic profiles. They have a different geographical profile. So we do have some, you know, the context is not the same between each of the areas. However, there were some consistencies in the data. And when I say consistencies, I mean there were some things that came out that, despite the fact that were different, were actually pretty similar. And that was fascinating in itself, because it then led us to have a really, really good conversation. And I think we did it at the site at the time I was in Perth, Bernadette, when we had one of our sharing sessions. We had a really good conversation about why is that? Yeah. What's happening in Perth and Kinross that's producing the same outcome on one of the development areas as in North Ayrshire, and yet when you look at our profiles as local authority and CPP areas, they're very different. And that was a brilliant conversation, but really helpful for us to learn and understand a bit more about what we're doing and what's what people are thinking about in their own homes, you know, what's happening with children, and really getting down to that much deeper level of understanding and discussion right across with us. And we actually, the session that I'm talking about, we had Scottish Government colleagues there as well. So they were able to understand some of that as well, because, and I don't know if we've got a lot of people here from Scottish Government today or not, but they're that one step removed from even where we are. And I don't think that we see enough of what goes on directly in our communities. So any information we get is really good, but it was, I think, probably even greater, better for them to see and hear all of this firsthand as well. I've probably said enough.
Thank you very much, Elma. Could you say something about the validity of the data?
I hope one of the benefits of taking this approach is that each site has collected the data in the same way. So it means that they have an ability to compare. And I think that's very powerful because, as Elma and Bernadette have said, they were able to look at Perth and Kinross and North Ayrshire and see similarities and kind of consider, well, why is that? And differences, and it sparks a different type of conversation. And to say the questions that are included in the survey are all validated, standardised measures that have been tested elsewhere. These weren't questions we made up. These, where possible, have normative data against which they can be compared. And the idea is data really doesn't help you unless you've got points of comparison. On your point about trust, I think this is incredibly important. First of all, the trust that young people have put in us in giving us this data and us matching that data with administrative data. We have a duty to do something good with that. Second, I don't think we all realise quite how significant it is to share data like this with communities. I know that Fiona Mackay had a phone call the other day from a parent, and she rang up, she said, well, I know you did surveys, and I know this school where I'm planning to send my child to wasn't doing such a great job on engaging children in learning. What have you done as a result of that survey? It changes the accountability that we have to our communities. So it's all very well doing a survey and getting great data, but it allows your communities to ask difficult questions. So it's not something to be entered into lightly.
Okay, there was a colleague down the front somewhere. There you are, just there. Can I have an indication of any other questions at this stage? Because I'm going to try and, right, 1, 2 and 3, and try and get those 3 questions in quickly before we get to coffee. So, and I think that'll be it. Sorry, on you go.
Angela Morgan, Chief Executive of Including, but my question is in my role as Chair of the Scottish Community Development Centre, and actually Louise's last answer touched on the question I have, and links to, I think, the comment that John Fife made about the fact that services are delivered in silos, but we live in communities. And I just wondered what experience the 5 sites have been able to develop, or the potential you see for really raising public awareness. And I suppose thinking about the whole agenda of community empowerment and resilience, which I think connects in with some of the expectations around some of the structural changes and integration. And it would just be interesting to hear where you think your work has got to in relation to that.
Perhaps I can say very quickly, one part of our E2S programme was to work with one of the communities, a significant community in Perth, to share the data. And the whole idea was about sharing the data with the community, but also taking community responsibility, not just the statutory agencies, but all of us taking responsibility for our children. I think Louise hinted that that has been quite a challenge. Perhaps because it's a different type of conversation that we normally have, but colleagues have continued to work with the community along with elected members, and we're continuing to share our thinking and continue the conversations so that as we move forward, there's a kind of shared ownership of what the priorities are for that local community in respect of children's services. But we've only been piloting that approach to use the data in that one community. But as Louise said, parents have the data, parent councils have the data about their schools. There's been discussions within localities with parents, and I do think that there's huge learning from this approach, which is the importance of data and having the conversations to underpin the whole community empowerment process about the stories of place and what we think is important in terms of the use of data, but the authentic voice of communities in terms of they know their community and what matters to them. And I think this data has huge potential in terms of moving forward with the community empowerment legislation. But that's Perth and Kinross, so people might... Tim, do you want to...
Can I say each of the 5 areas are at different stages. There's the, I'm from Angus, as you know, and we were the last group of 3. So I suppose the approach we're taking is broadly similar to where Perth and Kinross are at, but maybe a slight step behind. For us, the data was really helpful in 2 ways. One is it helped us clearly, as a community planning partnership, to clearly identify our key developmental outcomes. We've identified 3 key developmental outcomes that actually form the basis of our new integrated children's services plan. So it's actually at that authority level, it's helping us set direction. But actually, it's really important that we actually see this as it's not just our data, but it's community data as well. So we've also been working with each of our localities and working with the schools within those localities and the local community planning partnerships around those. So we're taking that sort of place approach to using the data. So at an authority level, we've got 3 key developmental outcomes. But at locality level, schools are working with community learning and development. They're working with the third sector, who are a key partner within this. They're working with the parent councils, etc. And they're working with the children and young people to actually identify their local priorities. And we're developing local implementation plans in each area as well.
Thank you very much, Tim. I'm conscious that coffee is beckoning, but I don't want to curtail this Q&A session. So if we could keep the questions short, and we'll keep the answers short to try and get the 3 questions in. But what I'll ask people to do is ask the 3 questions, and then the panel will answer them. So can we have the 3 questions? The gentleman there. Sorry, I'm not managing this very well, sorry.
My name is William Campbell. I'm an elected member in Fife. One of these elected members that Elma was referring to. I have a role in Fife leading on both early years and looked after children. And I'm delighted to see that so much of what we're doing, things like Incredible Years, Family Nurture and so on, is being given real reassurance from the work that the 5 authorities have done. But can I be one of these querulous people about that 3 circles diagram? One of the things that I must say worried me, it looks as if something like 75% of the spend required for these 25% of youngsters, these 20% of youngsters, is already there, but some of it isn't going to them. What have your authorities done about that bit of the 15% that sits outside the 20%? Because clearly there is a level of spend happening there, which your survey would seem to suggest is being misapplied. And I'm interested to know how you've tackled that, because clearly there's a bit of decommissioning there that could be incredibly difficult and very sensitive.
Thank you very much. Peter will answer that just in a moment, but I'm going to take the other 2 questions, if I may. There was one in the middle here. Yes, sir.
Hi there. I just want to say that it's great to be here. The project sounds absolutely fascinating. I've got a question to you, Louise. The statistic which says that 1 in 5 children are in need, could you define the need to me? Because I would like to get an understanding of what it actually means. And the other one is to everyone else, I suppose. It's good that there's talk about research, but if you could give me an example of how this research, or findings of this research, have been translated into practice, into something which is tangible, small, because I can hear a lot of strategic talk, which is great, but what does it actually mean? So, thanks.
Thank you very much. And Sally? Thank you. Could do it. Yep.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Sally Ann Kelly from Aberlour Childcare Trust. My question, and again it's within the context of seeing this as a really quite challenging but very welcome initiative, is around the need part of it. So I'm not familiar enough with the questionnaires and the surveys, but we have talked about risks and identified risks and needs. I suppose the question for me is, does the survey allow you to quantify how much of that need is unmet? And one of the things that I would suggest is that parents and families themselves, albeit there might be issues, will be resilient enough to be delivering on any need that the child has. And does the survey allow you to capture all of that? Because I'm a wee bit concerned that there might be some false positives in here in terms of the overall situation. And within that, and I appreciate there's lots of discussion with families and their participation at some levels, but are we really capturing the true strengths of communities in terms of the work that we're doing. And I'm interested in Peter talking about the kind of redesign in the next phase, and whether that is actually something that will be embodied in that as well.
Thank you very much. So quite a number of questions within questions, if I may. Peter, can you pick up specifically the issue about the children who are in need but not receiving the services and what we're doing about it, but also kind of tangible examples of impact, please?
I think, and to be brief, there is a seminar in the question that you've asked about the circles and the meeting in need. I think that one of the tests for Renfrewshire, and the first anywhere, is how that need is shifting in the basis of the next data set. So the answer to your question will be revealed when we actually look at the impact, the real impact, the practice impact, the impact on outcomes for children and families when we do the survey later on this year. Secondly, I think that the very metrics, hopefully, that I presented, we have 50 less children, less accommodated children. However, the number of children that we identify in the earliest years, partly, and I think substantially because of our investment in early years, a bit like Fife, we identify those young children very early, and sometimes they have to be in long-term care. So we've shifted that bar. The 25 young people that are not in care services just now through functional family therapy are teenagers. So we're shifting that bar significantly. And I think we should see a better match between need and service when we do the reconfiguration, the data, again at the end of this year. That's my hope. I think the challenge will continue to be there. The point that was asked about practice, I am not the best to address that. Can I say the practitioners in Renfrewshire, and can I say more importantly the parents, will tell the story. Please come and talk to us, because that story is about not just programmes, but cultural shift about what it is that we do with families, walking in their shoes, not to them. And the most powerful story of all is the families now in incredible years that are the peer educators that now engage with families that are coming into the services saying, this is how I'm dealing with the situation when it's really difficult on the bus coming to the pre-5 service in the morning. So that's the story that I think would be helpful for you to hear in real time in Renfrewshire.
Louise, can you say something about defining need? Of course, we didn't, because people wouldn't have seen from the slides about the 10 developmental outcomes that we measured children against, but could you say quickly about how we defined need?
Sure. So if you go onto the portal, you'll see the red circle. If you hover over it, you get a whole list of different risk factors and key developmental outcomes. We have set what is a relatively arbitrary threshold of 5 risk factors. Now, there's a sort of intuitive sense that if a young person came to you with 5 or more of these risk factors, you would think their developmental outcomes are going to be impaired. But it is arbitrary. You could say 6, you could say 4, but our sense is that if you have 5 or more of those risk factors, your development will be impaired. So it's quantified and it's on the portal. In response very quickly to the other point, we are not saying that you should be providing services to all the people, all the families in the red circles. Just as you said, communities and families are well equipped to cope with the challenges for many families. However, it does highlight that there is an awful lot of need out there that does not come to your door. So as you try to offer more capacity, you will have more need respond to that capacity.
Thank you very much. And final comment from Michael. Could you deal with Sally's points about resilience and false positives in the data?
Yes, I think in terms of just a bit of reassurance, in terms of the false positive dimension, the situation across the 5 council areas that each one of us, as a result of the survey itself, were able to identify very, very clearly what were the key improvement priorities we require to address. And once you've done that, those become the markers that you've set down for future development. And every one of our, whether it be the staff working with us or one of our partner agencies or one of our third sector colleagues, will be asked to look at what they're doing in terms of their delivery and saying how closely does your work stream align itself to our key improvement priorities. And if the answer to that is it works very well, that's fine. If the answer is it doesn't, then that's when the grander debate starts. So I think that given the fact that the level of data that we have allows us to really identify key improvement areas for each council, that's fantastic. But I think, secondly, one of the real challenges out there in terms of the data comes back to the point that Louise made, is that there comes a point when you've got to stop looking at the data and making the change happen. And that's where we remove that worry about negatives, etc.
Thank you very much, Michael. And colleagues, sorry for running over time, but it was important, I think, to try and get those questions in. We're all here because this matters, and I think you've heard a number of colleagues say this morning, this is the most important transformational work that any of us have been involved in terms of children's services, and we're absolutely committed to this. That's why we're here and why we're delighted that you're here. So thank you very much.